Although we tend to think about the Civil War as ending with the Emancipation Proclamation and essentially everything being happily ever after the slaves were freed, Reconstruction failed due to the government's lack of a coherent strategy, which created a power vacuum in the former Confederacy. This happened because of the fog of war, because of no unified political leadership, and because of ex-Confederate terrorists. My first point is the fog of war. Sherman, so first I'm going to talk about some things that happened in the midst of the war, particularly General Sherman Williams' campaign. He was one of the first people in modern history he was the first person in modern history to use total war. And while this was successful, it made Reconstruction harder. Total war is essentially breaking the unwritten rules of war, like attacking civilians and things like that. As General William Sherman says, war is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. So he thinks that by doing this, he will actually help people because he will end the war quicker, which it did quickly end the war. He gave field order, So in his campaign called March to the Sea, he and his men marched from Atlanta to Savannah. They did many things. They wrecked, they burned homes, they pillaged, they killed people, they stole, they destroyed a lot of railroads on their march to the sea. And many people were harmed. They essentially left like a very wide path of destruction and a very long one. One of the things he did to all of the Confederates was he would find the big slave owners who were anti-North, and he would take their land and give it to the slaves. This was called Field Order Number 15, which he did along the way, or once he got there. So, Field Order 15, he gave the land to the slaves and took it from the slave owners. So many slaves were living on this land for a while, but it was not legally binding. And later, when Andrew Johnson became president, he would undo this. So all of this, all these loose ends created in the South led to trouble reconstructing, and the land debacle led to mistrust between former slaves and former slave owners. And even not only were there problems after the bulk of the war had ended, but some Confederate factions refused to surrender and even fought long after the war had officially ended. Point 2 is... Point 2. There was a struggle for political leadership. President Lincoln made a decision in that time. He made a decision to ask Southern Democrat Andrew Johnson to be his vice president. He wanted to do this to kind of unify the country, but it kind of made some problems, and it made Reconstruction more difficult. Division between Andrew Johnson and radical Republicans led to a lot of problems, and led to a big fight between the executive and legislative branch. This fight would make Reconstruction harder. Let me explain a little bit what happened. So, ever since Andrew Johnson was a kid, he had always had kind of a hatred for rich people, specifically because they had bullied him as a child. And so this reason, these rich plantation owners, his hatred for them made him want to end slavery. So J. Moore says, Andrew Johnson's interest in ending slavery came not from moral principles, but from his personal sense of inferiority to the wealthy planters. So he wanted to end slavery for that reason, and that's why, he worked with Lincoln. But when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, if you remember, many of those lands that were taken when Andrew Johnson became president, and with those lands that the slaves were living on that used to be their owners, which they didn't technically own, he took those and he used them as kind of bargaining power to make all the rich plantation owners come and beg him for them. Many of them literally appeared in front of him and begged to get their land back. And so essentially he just spent time working on his own, petty grudges instead of actually doing his job as president. And he was very lenient with the Southern, with the Southerners. He made them beg. That was about it. But the president, the radical Republican Congress at the time did not like this leniency, and did not like the way he was doing things. So they kind of got into a bit of a fight. Now, so Andrew Johnson, he went on a speaking tour, kind of to campaign against, essentially, the radical Republican Congress. But during this tour, he was heckled a couple times, but he just could not handle criticism, and many times he would literally collapse. So seeing this, of course, the amount of heckling only increased, and he ended up just kind of, making himself look a lot worse. Making the now veto-proof Republican majority look even better. And so he was just resorting to all sorts of trickery to try and kind of control them, but it didn't really work. Eventually, he was impeached by the House and acquitted in the Senate. But it was things like this, the struggle for power, that also made it difficult to rebuild. The third reason is ex-Confederate terrorists, particularly the Ku Klux Klan. They were developed as a social group for Confederate vets and eventually developed into a terrorist organization. So using its power to kill without consequence as a tool of intimidation, the Ku Klux Klan thwarted many of the better organized aspects of the Reconstruction Project, and media coverage of the KKK and positive cinematic depictions of the terrorist group helped to spread its message and revive its organization. But what exactly was the Ku Klux Klan? Well, to really understand it, we have to go back a long time to a fraternity called the Sons of Malta. They drank a lot, and they had a lot of weird rituals, a lot of which included murder. And so they were kind of a knockoff of this old fraternity. They liked them, so they had their outfits, their hoods, and it was meant to basically resemble ghosts. So their whole thing was kind of just to scare people, all their rituals and their outfits. So commonly what they would do is they would send letters to people and threaten them to vote Democrat. Part of this threatening also included things like, standing in circles around their houses, burning crosses on their lawns at night. And they also murdered people sometimes. But the burning crosses, I'm just going to talk about that for a second. Why did they burn crosses? Turns out it actually kind of symbolizes declaration of war or calling an army together or just any sort of signal So they use this as kind of their way of scaring people. And also they would stand circles around people's house. Actually, the name Ku Klux Klan literally means, or it translates in Greek to secret circle and then clan, but misspelled. So how many people did they actually kill? John Greenberg says Tuskegee University work confirms 3,446 black documented lynchings and another 1,300 lynchings of whites. Although we tend to think about the Civil War as ending with the Emancipation Proclamation and all the slaves being freed and living happily ever after, Reconstruction failed due to the government's lack of a coherent strategy, which created a power vacuum in the former Confederacy. Many reasons of this were the fog, or 3 reasons of this were the fog of war, no unified political leadership, and ex-Confederate terrorists. Thank you.